Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Making the Rounds. I have, healed Emily with my healing powers just so she could
True.
appear on the show, not for any other reason. like
Not so
doing,
I can go and broadcast.
like doing her job. That would be ridiculous. But yeah, so that's top news of the entire show, entire tournament. We can leave now. But we did want to kind of go through the groups because we hadn't talked about the main stage groups before and
hmm
highlight the main storyline, kind of going through which groups we think are going to be really exciting going into week two, and also just like players that we feel like should be shouted out more. So let's start with what's your favorite letter in A through D, Emily?
Just generally, I don't have a favorite letter, but my favorite group is B
Your favorite
because
group
it's a
is B?
banger, and
Okay.
that's where I think the best game of the tournament, or the best of one we've had thus far between JDG and Damwon, I think was from that group. So, uh, yeah, and I also think like even though EG or O3, I think they've looked the best gameplay wise of any
So
any team.
so you
So
mean
this
group
this entire group has been interesting.
so group B, right?
Yeah, groupie.
Nice. Okay. My favorite letter, in case you're wondering, in A through D is actually C, but that group is less
Ooh,
interesting. So we'll talk about your favorite letter.
unlucky.
Um yeah, I mean it is definitely I think most people would argue that the best game of the tournament was the JD demo game. I personally preferred the RNG 100 game because I would geek out about how teams play sidelines in obscure situations, but it was not actually that high quality of games. So we have that going for us. But I think it's been really fun to watch. I think there hasn't been a single game in this group except for maybe like EGG2 that I thought was just not worth watching. I don't know.
hmm
Maybe you can argue G2 DK sucked. Uh that game did kind of suck. And I think part of that is just like the nature of JD. Uh JD gaming and how they play out their games is being like very back and forth, very like on the edge of losing.
Yeah,
Definitely the team at this tournament who is I can't believe they can't keep getting away with this, like that kind of team. So yeah.
yeah,
Uh
and that's not. I mean, I think I want to stress to people that's not
mhm.
any different than watching them before. Like, it's not. This is not uncharacteristic of them. They're not a team. Anyway, I don't know what you thought. They're not a team that I expected to come in and be like, we're gonna overwhelmingly smash our opponents. They've looked their play has looked about what I've expected in terms of how they look like they're going to lose until they don't.
Everyone jokes about how there's always a team that you have to sacrifice for the success of the region in LPL. And I think a lot of people thought it would be TS, which that's the obvious low hanging fruit one. I thought there was a decent chance it was JD Gaming because of the change in the AD meta being like play really hard around bot lane. Um, and from that perspective, but they're still just playing like let's camp top and have Kanavi power farm, and it's still working for them. So I thought there was a chance that JD would collapse because they were always on the edge. TS were always on the edge. So that was
Yep.
where my thought process was, but they did great, guys. They did spectacular. And I just love how many parallels there are this worlds with 2020 worlds, for example. Like JD Damwon in the same group, they went 1-1,
Yep.
things like that. So I'm excited to see the second round robin play out because I assume it won't be as cut and dry as this one, especially with the JD Damwon game going the way it did.
Yeah, I think they'll probably split.
Split 1-1. So you think Damwon's gonna win the second game?
Yeah. I
I
think really despite the fact that they obviously are 2-1 and not
mhm.
3-0, I think very highly of Damwon.
Yeah, I do as well. I think they're the one LCK team. Like I actually wasn't super high on Genji. I had all of the LCK teams getting out first because I figured LPL will always lose at least one game
Yep.
in group stage. Uh, but I was also just higher on Damwon from doing their VOD review than I was on either T1 or Genji actually, because of the fact that like every time people told me Canyon was bad, I would watch the VODs and I'd be like, he's actually not really that bad because he is just playing for um disadvantaged trades when his bot lane is like not real and not existing. So they always lose the game at like level 3. By level 3, Dr. and Kellen like domestically, and then Canyon is doing this like really really hard flip trade on top side that makes no sense, but it's like if the trade works out then they're back in the game, you know. So that's why I don't think Canyon's that bad this year compared to a lot of people in diagnosing Canyon. So I was like, oh, plus this season, right, or this world's, a lot of his champions are going to be in vogue.
Hmm.
You're going to be able to play like the power farming jungle style. So like Damwon, this is Damwon's year for a two-peat if they can make it to the final.
Yeah, so obviously I was not on broadcast, but one of the things I was gonna do because I was supposed to be on broadcast day one, and I was gonna do the hottest take segment,
Mm-hmm.
which they've done the whiteboard for other people. But my hot take, without seeing a single game, was gonna be that Tom and we're
Flaming
gonna
hot
win
take.
worlds. Yeah, like because and it was solely because like I was like, man, on the one hand, that KT series, which was like scuffed on so many levels, was still living rent free in my head, as I tweeted out.
Mm-hmm.
But prior to seeing them play a single game, I was like, okay, Graves is back, Hecarim's back. Like there's a lot
Yep.
of things that Canyon can really pop off on. As long as they're starting uh, Nogody in the top lane, then I think they actually are like a pretty big contender to win Worlds. Again, this is a really good meta for them. People were joking after their G2 game where they're just like, we're going to draft like it's 2020. And like they did, and
Yep.
they won. And I know people were kind of not happy with that, but I think it does show how the current world's meta can be really, really good for them. And provided that they like continue to improve on what we've already seen from them in groups, I think you definitely actually shouldn't count them out.
Yeah, I think my favorite thing about this Damwon team is just the I think my favorite excuse me. I think my favorite conversation I've had so far at Worlds was like when Nymera made that tweet about how Naguri's champ pool has been super sus lately, you know? Like where he's like, he's picking like Jace, he's picking these things, and then like Cubby instantly DMs me like that this has this guy not watched Naguri and obviously like poor Nightmare is the butt of this joke, but that is definitely it is more of a joke that is rude to Nuggery than anything because I just remember like Nuggery doesn't believe in the jungle. Nuggery doesn't believe in scaling. Like if you don't win lane, the game is over. Uh, and then I miss like 2020 again or 2019 actually. It was 2019 again because like him and the Shy, like their banter
Yep.
back and forth was so like not self-aware, you know? Like completely like Noguri was like, "Yeah, I look up to the Shy," and the Shy was like, "But Noguri is dumb and he doesn't respect the jungler." And I'm just
Oh my
like,
god.
"Bro, have you
Do
seen
you
this?"
do you so again, this is unrelated and a little off topic, but I have to tell the story. Have you ever seen the clip of Cloud Templar
Mm,
talking to the Shy? And like the Shy was a guest on the LCK broadcast and he was just like ripping apart every
oh yeah, yeah.
um top laner, and he's like, well, what would you have done? Like basically Cloud Templar is desperately trying to get the Shy to admit that he is just like them and the
Yep.
only difference is in his head, and he just doesn't. He just
Yeah.
stays steadfast. He's like, no, they're all stupid.
Yeah, he is a
It's great.
very
It's amazing. I love this show.
not self-aware. But By the way, everyone, we will talk about NA. Well, we're gonna save most of the NA ranting until the end, but I do think we should talk about G2 a little bit before we move on, because you mentioned that like G2 are drafting like 2020 and winning or whatever, or no,
I
damn
said
wanna
DK were,
yeah, damn wanna drafting
yeah,
like 2020
against G2.
and beat G2. I think it's interesting to me. Like the most interesting thing to me about G2 is G2 in 2020 they were completely off on how to play the mid jungle meta. And what I appreciate is that like the trying to articulate what the mid jungle mid is now is very difficult because it's easy to say
Mhm.
stuff like fast farming jungle meta, but it's not really because jungle XP still sucks. So you can't just play to like fast farm
True.
and build like huge experience leads on jungle. You still have to kind of like acknowledge lanes. Especially since camp respawn timers are still lower than they were in like 2020. Like 2020 was legit like Suning got away with letting their top laner die so that SFM could get a bot side quadrant, and that was like a good trade for Suning, you know? So it was like ridiculous in 2020. In 2022, it's more like um there's you have to basically choke out the enemy jungler with your lead using your laners, right? It has to be like you play for the 2v2 and then you extend your lead to a side lane and then you just
Mhm.
control enough of the game that your jungler is ahead, right? Whereas before it was like if you just perma farm and are constantly invading and are constantly using prio, you're going to be like 3 levels up. This one requires
Yeah.
like way more concentration to get a jungle lead because of the existence and the current state of jungle XP. So I think that actually suits G2 a bit more because they're Yankos is one of the best junglers in the world when it comes to identifying specifically around mid matchup timers for interfering with the lane state. So that works really well for G2, even though like arguably they don't want to be playing like this heavy farm jungle style. So
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think you, I think you kind of saw that the evolution of that from their Tom One game to some of their later games. Like you said, I think that's something that Yonkos has always done really well. And then additionally, Caps is just such a strong laner and they have such good synergy that it is, I mean, these two are essentially how G2 turned their spring around this year, right? And
mm-hmm.
and went to MSI. Which is why it was their first draft was super interesting to me because I don't hate it, but I also for as much damage as Seraphine does and as much push as she can get, I really liked seeing Caps on stuff more like the Silas, right? Where he has a little bit more agency to make plays. In that mid jungle duo. So I was glad that they kind of quickly adjusted that because it's not as much disagreeing with the pick as it is disagreeing with the pick specifically for Caps and the way that G2 really have to work around having such a strong mid jungle duo together. I just always like it when Caps is on a little bit more of a playmaker. I don't consider Seraphine a playmaker with a ton of agency. Maybe people agree because she can be super broken in certain situations and she does get pushed. But yeah, I was happy to see them adjust almost immediately. Um,
Yep.
and I think yeah, I'm very curious to see what they end up doing in the back half. It's going to be talking about the first part of groups more broadly. It was very apparent that the scrim pockets of teams came up with very different answers because there wasn't boot camping for the EU and NA teams typically who would go to some sort of South Korean boot camp to scrim LCK and LPL teams. Um, and I thought it was really interesting what answers people brought to the table. And now it'll be very curious to see. We already saw that beginning to mix by the end. And now I'm curious to see what people bring to the table after having 2 days off.
I am also curious. Yes, we be full. There will be a lot of this on YouTube. Just for everyone who's curious. Also, we are not doing viewer questions necessarily, but someone did ask if we would when we would start writing again, Emily. So, that is keep that in mind that we still have people who want to read our shitty articles. So, excellent. Uh,
Nice.
well, my
Let's
articles were
go.
shitty. Your articles were good. Anyway,
No.
onward and
I do miss
upward.
writing features though. I was just tweeting at Shaka the other day about how I miss interviewing players.
Yeah. So, yeah, I do. I actually was looking at a lot of my old writing and realized that so many of my articles have just gotten taken down because the score just like completely imploded. LOL Esports deleted all of my old
Yep.
articles, etc. So it's just like, damn, like I did all of that work. Like, keep in mind, Emily and I were doing like 2 to 3 articles a week minimum, right?
Yep.
And that's just like all gone.
It's all gone.
It's like we were never here. Anyway.
I have my Faker article from 2016, The Man in the Red Jacket, and then the Rocks Tigers article also from 2016 downloaded for that reason. And as soon as I learned that ESPN was going down, I downloaded like all of the articles I really liked from
Yeah.
myself.
I think I so like with the thing is with Yahoo and ESPN, I have all the docs, like the Word docs. Because
Mm,
I wrote them all in like Google Docs, which is why I have no doc space left on my Google Drive. Which, yes, keep in mind, Google Docs, like they're like 2%, so little document. There's so little drive space. Like I just don't have space
mm-hmm.
anymore because of how many fucking articles I had. But all of my the score articles I didn't save, so they're just gone. Unlucky, because I keep wanting to reference like some of them. Like I remember I made one that was on Xiaohu and Shia that I really liked, and I was like, "Yep, fun while it lasts."
Ma- Mako or Breako
Yeah,
was a score article, right?
yeah, that one I can just if I just want to meme the title, I can just grab that from Reddit, Mako or Breako. Um, but there was another Mako one that I wanted to because I was like talking about his history, and I remember writing one that was called "The Rookie in the MSI Finals." Uh, but that was on the score as well, so it's gone. Anyway, aside done. Player to watch in Group B, and we'll move on to the next group.
So this should come as no surprise to anyone, based on what we talked about. But for me, it's Canyon. I agree with Kelsey that I think his demise was overblown a bit. See that person yelling in the background agrees with me.
Yeah,
And I think that the fact that it is such a good meta for him, the fact that it's a pretty good meta for Showmaker as well, and those two are, I think the two around which this team is able to pivot. Also, if Nogody is starting in the top lane, it also helps. But yeah, Canyon is definitely my player to watch from Group B.
yeah. I think you're lucky, and you're the only one who can see my room, hear my roommates. So congratulations.
Oh, okay, that's good.
But okay, yeah. Mine I think is I'll pick someone from JD, and I'll just say 369 because everyone knows if you follow me on Twitter already that I am a 369 fan. I just remember 369 and Breathe actually debuted in the same tournament for
Mhm.
for like LPL teams. So I really like that storyline in terms of like I remember because I casted the in spring I casted the BLG JD series, which was a train wreck in spring, by the way. It was absolutely terrible. But I just wanted to talk about the historical interactions between Breathe and Bin, so I asked for B-roll from like that tournament in 2018.
Oh God, nice.
LPL production was like, what the fuck? Anyway,
Why are
uh,
you asking for this?
exactly. Um, but yeah, I think that's like for me, Breathe. 369 story is just so cool because like obviously I'm the biggest Zoom fan alive. I will watch him walk into a group of 5 people as
Run
Kale
it down.
with no ult for the rest of my life. and just say, yes, he's beautiful and perfect and can do no wrong. So yeah, it is but 369's like trajectory and story has been really good. And I know that 369 is like not typically the type of top laner that I like. But because he is very reliant on jungle leads and jungle pressure, but I think he's the best player in the tournament, and I keep hyping him up, and he keeps playing like fucking Sejuani. But that's okay. Moving on.
Oh my god.
um, so I said that my favorite letter is C, not necessarily my favorite group, and we are supposed to talk about whether or not top esports suck anyway. So
True.
let us go to Group C. So what are you most excited about in this group? What's like your biggest storyline?
Um, for this group, I am the most excited about Rogue. I think that going into any tournament where it's obviously Fnatic and G2, they both have incredible history in League of Legends. They both have, massive fan bases. And Rogue, before they won this final and even afterwards, was kind of like the team that everyone was like, oh, they're not as good. They keep choking in playoffs, et cetera, et cetera. I myself was very hesitant to when they signed Malrong in the very beginning of the year, um, because I've watched Malrong since him and Septed were supposed to be this like the next great South Korean like mid jungle duo. When I believe they were on Winners, or it might have been Ever Eight Winners at that point. Someone can correct me in chat. Um, but yeah, I think he has been such a huge force for this team, and I'm not going to always defend his actions as the most efficient, but I think in terms of how he targets his lanes, he's been really, really good. He comes up with some very creative answers. And overall, this Rogue team is looking I've said this elsewhere, but I think they're actually the team. Given the teams in their part of it is the teams in their group, but and part of it is how well they've been playing. I think they're probably the team that's most likely to go undefeated in all of the groups. Like they're the 3-0 team that I can see actually going 6-0. And I'm just really, really happy because I feel like people have always kind of counted Rogue out for a really long time. So it's cool to see them come to this tournament and smash the first round robin.
I think it's interesting that it feels like no one in this group has actually properly scouted Rogue. Because I think they play like I would say, for example, like Rakan is probably Trimby's best known pick in terms
Mm-hmm.
of his career. He's basically Rogue always wants to have like the 2v2 bot lane, and they always want to have like a top lane that just absorbs pressure, and Maokai is like an old Odoamna throwback. Um, so for me, there's a lot of like, and it feels like people are in general are just not scouting the EU teams in their groups because, for example, Humanoid getting Azir 3 times is fucking whack. But we'll get to that later. It does feel a bit like there's just like not a lot of scouting of Rogue, but having said that, I do really really like this team. I think because I think that there's a chance that someone has good strategy against them. Like I think if you deny the Trundle, or if you deny the Maokai, pick the Trundle, basically just like keep effectively topside down. The one thing that I think I don't like about Trimby as much as a bunch of other people is that he doesn't really roam as much as a lot of other supports. Like I would
Mm-hmm.
say, like Atagamus in G2 is really really good at timers for top lane, for example. So you can't really attack top. Odo Omna is just like he's been one of my favorite top laners for so long, to this point that it's like almost inarguable that he's my favorite top laner like in league history. Just because of the fact that he has always been like really, really exemplary when it comes to things like wave management, um, and just being able to sustain a lead for himself even when he is not the main carry of the team, but also at like 2016 Worlds, because I love historical references. You know, he was playing like the Jaces, like all of those types of champion picks and winning and the cannons and like winning lane like really handily. So he just like understands the wave dynamics in lane like extremely well, and he's managed to keep up with that over the course of his long career. So for me, it's like love Odo Amna, have really enjoyed watching him play, but also for the love of God, like, can you guys find the ban button for Maokai or something? Because Jesus Christ. Um,
Also, so the other point is
mhm.
going back to what I said about the scrim meta. I think Lucian Nami was obviously something that we saw from Rogue all summer, and uh, both Fnatic and Rogue brought it out. Um, I was surprised at how many people were shocked to see that, because when they locked it in, I was like, oh, okay, this is just Rogue playing their preferred playstyle, and I felt like people were like really surprised uh, that they locked it in. Um, and so that's another kind of interesting thing that they brought to the table in a world where we're not sure how teams are going to interpret the meta now that they've all been able to see each other play and hopefully scrim against each other, not in regional pockets. So I wanted to point that out as like oh, it seems like the European teams came to the table with this, and I definitely think Lucian Nami is something that we've seen Rogue gravitate towards for a while.
Yep.
So I was surprised at how many people were surprised that they brought it out.
Yeah. And if Rogue do go 6-0, that is like definitely the most exciting storyline because an EU team has never gotten 6-0 or undefeated
Mm-hmm.
in group stage. Even in the season one where they won, they actually did worse in group stage than NA did. And those were the only two regions in season one. Anyway, um but so they've basically never had an undefeated group stage in history. I don't think LPL has either. I haven't verified that one, but according to my memory, whereas the EU
I
one
don't
I actually have verified, but I don't remember an
I don't
LPL team
remember
ever doing it
LPL
either.
ever going undefeated.
Yeah.
They've
So,
always dropped a game, but someone in chat could correct us on that too.
but I think like for example, DRX have diagnosed like what TS are bad at pretty well. They've diagnosed like a few things, so I actually see DRX being able to beat them. And then I don't know, TS like if they flip a coin, there's like a 20% chance or something. So, I actually don't think they'll go 6-0, but I think that they'll maintain their first place group standing.
So Kelsey, do TES suck?
Yes. No. Um, it's sad because like I really want the Jackie love story to come through, right? Like I really
Same.
want it to be like he has such a good storyline. Like this guy was so good at 2020 Worlds. Like people were shitting on Knight, etc., but he had the best Senna in the tournament, right? I remember his laning was quite good as an individual. He just had a corpse in his lane. Sorry, to Yuyandra. Yuyandra's gotten way better. Like he took the feedback and improved, but he's also still a Rakan one trick. Whereas like I think in 20, so he had that story arc where he made TS better, like having some kind of leadership skills going into that team and giving them a direction to play around. TS obviously didn't make 2021 Worlds, and then they completely retooled their roster, and it's basically just him and Knight staying from that 2020 roster. And he basically solo lost, like TS were winning, and he solo lost them the first seed going into the World
Mm-hmm.
Championship against JDG. So it would be so good if suddenly, you know, Jackie Love's able to play aggressive bot meta. He has a slightly better supports, even though Mark is not like a top support at the tournament. He's definitely better than Yuyandra. Their laning is improved. He can play like he should theoretically be able to play these aggro matchups and
Mm-hmm.
lead the team to victory with his style of play. But it's like we're not gonna get that storyline because I swear this guy is just like inting. If I turn away to get a coffee, if I like close my eyes for 5 seconds, I open them and Jackie Love is somehow dying, and I don't know why. Uh,
Yeah.
it's not negative gaming. Just
I don't I don't know what's going on. Like, so I'm not going to say this is uncharacteristic of Jackie Love because I also don't necessarily think it is. However, it does feel like he feels forced to make plays, and I don't know if that is an extension of getting torn apart from his play in the finals, or if it's something else that popped up in the team scrims going into this tournament. I also think that Wayward has looked a bit nervous or off. Because watching him, I believe it was in their last game on the Gnar. Gnar is one of his best champions. It's something that he's like super comfortable with, and he still looked very uncomfortable, like uncharacteristically uncomfortable on one of his best champions, in my opinion. Um, so that just makes me sad, you know. Like I too want to see PES come out and look really good because this team has very interesting and strong players. Um, but yeah, they look like they feel like they are forced to make a lot of plays when they get something when they lock in something like a Draven. It's a very like snowbally kind of draft, and obviously Jackie Love is a Draven player. If that play goes slightly in his favor, that game might have turned out differently. But it's also just like, oof, I don't know. It just makes me sad.
Wayward, I'm not too surprised by because I was more surprised by like how high people were on Wayward, and I can blame Mr. Daniel Hockley for this, like Ox,
Oh no,
because I do
poor
think
Ox. He loves Wayward.
he does love Wayward, and I am not super hard on Wayward because it's his rookie year, and I have a rule where I can't flame rookies on my stream. But I would say he's basically a Nara Sejuani 2 trick, so he's got that going for him. And he hasn't looked great on Gnar. I think he's a little bit lost in terms of like laning and setup and things like that. But again, like this is his rookie year, so I expected that.
Yeah,
I'm not like too surprised by it. It is just like a little bit sad that he is not having a breakout rookie year. That would be nice, but I didn't expect it. So we do have that going for us. Um, the yeah, I don't know. TS is I'm sad. I kind of wish that Ox were like on the desk or something because then he could come in and give like this motivational speech at the start of the TES group and talk about how they're
right.
beautiful and lovely because that would be fantastic. And then they would go
Maybe we can have
0.
him call in.
Yeah. And then they would crash and burn and go 0-3, but no. Yeah. So
The cursed PES monologue from their greatest fan on the LPL broadcast.
Exactly. But yeah, I do love this team a lot, and I always root for them because they're just so fun to watch because they do like literally
Yep.
flip everything, and their macro is terrible. So unless they get like a 20k gold lead at 10 minutes, and I'm not exaggerating, you need like a 20k gold lead at 10 minutes. They're not gonna beat like good teams. But there's a reason why we say XX macro. It's a good time.
I love the XX Smacker meme. It's one of my favorites.
I think one thing in this group that's gone a little under the radar is because everyone obviously in the English speaking audience and the NA audience is freaking out about 0-9 is like the fact that GAM haven't won a game. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, I think for most people this was like one of the easier groups for GAM to get slotted into, but I also didn't have high expectations for them either. I think I ended up like randoming my group order for this group because I saw it as being like, oh, anything random could happen and I wouldn't be surprised. So this was the only one where I literally flipped the coin on my pick'ems. But yeah, I'm a little bit. I think like people are not talking about GAM's performance because they don't care as much as NA, but it is a little bit sad as well. I don't know. What are
Mhm.
your thoughts on GAM's performance?
I think it's sad. I keep going back to how much we're talking about like how the jungle meta has shifted, even if you are a carry jungler, and this similarly to someone like Canyon. I think this is actually a really good meta for Levi. Graves is also one of his best champions, right? But I also think that the way they've approached it with a lot of these like level 1 invades that don't work out, or how he can over focus on power farming, and then you can see some good setups and some good team fighting from them. But at that point in the game, they're so far behind that it doesn't matter how well they're positioning or how much damage Levi can do on Graves, because the other team is already so far ahead. And a lot of the time, it will have happened in the first like 5 minutes,
Yep.
due to these invades, due to the enemy team taking advantage of the fact that Levi is pretty much just power farming. So I think it kind of points back to a little tweak that they would have to make in terms of like how they see um, mid jungle. And I also think it's sad because there are a lot of really cool storylines on this GAM team as well, particularly Kiaya. I know there are people on broadcast who've kind of been waiting to talk about and tell his story, because it's really, really interesting. And I can link a video that was made, I think, by GAM themselves, or maybe someone related to VCS, but it tells their story, and specifically Kia's story is like really, really both like heartbreaking and heartwarming, in terms of like where he came from and what League of Legends means to him. I'll link it on Twitter after this is done,
Oh.
so people can watch it. But yeah, like there are a lot of cool storylines that we could talk about
Hmm.
with GAM, and it's just been kind of hard because they've looked,
Yeah.
pretty outclassed by every team in this group.
I feel like on that day, it's like probably good as like a final send off to tell a story like before their last game, at least, just because
Yeah.
it's like this is what we want you to remember about GAM, not that they went 0 whatever. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think I went into this tournament expecting them to be like a 1 or 2 player team, depending on how Kiaya performed. And kind of feels like that a bit. Like their bottom lane has been a struggle for sure. So I think that that's part of it, since there are a lot of like good top jungles in this group, or not good top jungles, but
Hmm.
a lot of good. I would say there's a lot of good bot lanes in this group, if anything. So that's made it very
Yeah.
difficult for GAM to exist. In a group with like Deft, Barrel, Jackie Love, Mark, and Comp Trimby, who are like
Yeah.
more focused on 2v2 than I would say a lot of other groups would be. Like if they were in a group with like a G2 or a Jingdong, then maybe their bot lane would live. Um,
Hmm.
JD Gaming, excuse me, JD Intel Esports Club.
Oh yeah, I forgot
Yeah,
yeah, they changed their name. Can't call
yeah.
them Dindong Gaming anymore.
But
Just like you
the
can't call GAM Gigabyte Marines.
exactly, it's the
Don't
same.
do it.
Player to watch in this group.
Hmm. Who do I want to pick from this group? Talked a lot about Rogue. I'm actually going to shout out Zeka, because he's someone that I did not think super highly of when he was in LPL. But he's had like a really standout year in LCK. And now coming to this event, it is a great meta for him. He keeps getting champs that he's very comfortable on. And he's had a phenomenal tournament from play-ins until now. And I also think it's another one of the reasons why DRX are doing so well, especially compared to like a lot of the like a lot of my expectations. First of all, I'm not an LCK caster, but I watched them go through, and I actually fully expected Sandbox to be here instead of them, as much as I would have wanted KT to be here. Rip. I think Zeka has been their, like, obviously you're going to talk about Deft, right? Because he's just this historic powerhouse AD. And there's a ton of stuff that he's going to be able to play in this meta that he's just going to be able to pop off on. But Zeka to me has been the breakout star of this team, in my opinion. And so I want to see some more cool things from him.
I was going to talk about Deft just because I think his storyline of his career is super interesting. Has been to Worlds multiple times, has not been able to win or even do that well. Has he even gotten? Oh yeah, KT. Has
Mhm.
he even gotten past quarters? Is that? Is that a thing?
Let's see what he lost in 2018 to
He lost because KT was
IG.
quarters, right?
Yeah,
And
which
EDG
people
has
then called the finals.
EDG has always lost in quarters. Um, I swear he hasn't gotten past quarters. Maybe he made a semis once that
He
I'm
made it.
blanking.
Samsung Blue made it to semi,
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
in
2014.
2014.
Yeah,
So he's been to semis once.
yeah. So he has been to semis once, but since 2014, this guy has had a really, really long career, and he has not made it past fucking quarters. So that is like a very cool storyline. But I also just like I cannot be in a group without Odo Omna and not talk about Odo Omna. Because I already did in terms of his playstyle and why I respect him as a player. But he's had a very interesting history. Like I think he's the first Romanian player to make it to like a major league. He's also like he constantly I think his biggest flaw is that he doesn't command like game plans around his leads, but he is very good at acquiring leads and he's very good at playing like the lane self-sufficiently. 2016 Worlds makes it all the way to semifinals. I think it's really interesting that he's in a group with Edward Gaming, or not Edward Gaming, excuse me, in a group with DRX because of Deft. So like that Odo Omna Deft storyline is there because they managed to go 1-1 and then win the quarterfinal or win the tiebreaker to make it out in the first group, that H2K team in 2016. So I think it's super interesting that we're seeing like the Deft Odo Omna rematch in that regard. And then the fact that he made it all the way to semis and they obviously got 3-0'd, but I think that's like a cool reprisal because I just remember how like if you go back and you look, all of the LCK top laners were talking about how good Odo Omna was at that tournament, like how he was like the best top laner at the event, etc., etc. There are videos about that. And so it's very interesting from that perspective. And also like last year when people were flaming this rogue and flaming his performances, he was suffering like from health problems. And I think that that's so he has like a very big redemption storyline, like along the same lines as Tien of like making a comeback after
Nice.
struggling with some health issues. So yeah, I think Odo Omna's story is like very exciting to get invested in for pretty much anyone. So good job, hooray! All right, let's go on to the next group so that we're not here all day. Next group, and Emily wants to go out and play. So next
I
group
do. I want to escape. I've been trapped in
is
here for a week.
let's talk about Group D, and then we can talk about Group A because I think it's exciting for most people. Anyway, Group D, what's main storylines?
Uh, Obviously, I think NG was one of the tournament favorites that was coming in, and people expected them to kind of race through this group, especially after they dropped a game to DFM in the in their play in best of five. However, RNG has looked good, and I also think
Oh,
I actually really want to give a shout out to CTBC Flying Oyster, who admittedly have been able to kind of play stuff that's very comfortable for them, right? Like
mm-hmm.
Mission in particular hasn't been shoved off of these control mages that he is so well known for. But I just really appreciate this team. Like I've liked Koala since I saw him at 2018 Worlds on G-Rex, I
Mm-hmm.
believe was
Yep.
the team he was on at the time. I just love how willing, like first of all, I think his engage sense is really good. But then additionally, I think he is so willing to just throw himself like his entire body into a team fight. And as long as the rest of the team follows up, usually ends up working out super well for them, even if he dies. And that kind of support I will always appreciate, especially if their team moves around them really well. So I'm happy to see that. I mean, Koala kind of never really moved off of engaged supports, and that was one of the things that was kind of interesting about this team coming into The tournament was that unlike a lot of other teams, they didn't play as many enchanters. So engagers coming kind of back in, although Yumi is still around, obviously, and there's the Lucian Nami, and bot lane is kind of a really interesting game of like rock paper scissors, depending on play style and 2v2 matchup. I just really want to watch Koala throw himself into team fights and have them win. I think they're really interesting. Obviously, Shin's story is really interesting as kind of the rookie. Like, I also love a good rookie surrounded by veteran players story. And that's kind of his story as well. So yeah, this team, I do think they're probably going to get more pushback in the second round robin. Maybe we'll see some more, like, we're just going to try to ban out slash pick away mages from mission and see how it works. But I've been pleasantly surprised at how good they've looked in this group with some pretty stiff competition from RNG and Genji.
I think it's interesting that Koala was on the GRX team, but it's also so like, but he's also been on multiple teams with Gemini and Mission, right?
Yep.
So, Machi, CFO, right? All those, and basically Mission was off the roster for Jimian, who is now in at 100 Thieves Academy.
100
So
T. Yeah.
yeah, they've played with each other on various rosters, and they've never looked like that great, but they also at a certain point they just have a lot of experience, and so when you add a player like Shun to the team, like you're starting to look really strong. I love all the memes and like stories that Rayra sent about like
Yeah.
Shun and Atlan or Alton. I can't remember the order of the L. It's the Atlan, like playing swapping off playing support and saying like never again.
That we never want to do this again in our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they've been fun. Also just like the fact that they managed to get a lot of comfort and really show what they can do against 100 Thieves, I think is going to be telling and interesting. In particular, so I've enjoyed watching them. I think obviously like I'm a big RNG fan, and I have to say it because Chronicler was in the chat, but the last time RNG and Genji were in a group together was the only time since the group stage format, or the 4 team group stage format change, or the format change, that a Korean team has not made it out of group stage. So if I can create a traumatic experience, there you go. That is the
I don't
traumatic
think that's gonna
experience.
happen in this game.
I don't know. You
I
never
do
know.
think so. So I will talk about Genji a bit, because I will say, compared to, part of it is just that this team obviously has exponential expectations from LCK fans based on how dominant they were in their final, right? And how dominant they were this season.
Yeah.
And also just how good people know these players to be individually. But I think they are 2-1. I still expect RNG and Genji to be the two teams that get out of this group. However, it has surprised me how shaky they have looked in these games. And I know you might disagree, because I think you are a lot lower on them than I was coming into this group. But I think, yeah, like from their first draft, where I really liked the first part of it, and then as much as I love the Lahen's Singed and the Singed Senna, it was an interesting look, but the draft itself wasn't overly cohesive between the bot lane and the top side, and then it ended up falling behind, and once it fell behind, it was just really difficult to get out from under that. And I also think they've just looked less comfortable than RNG, which is something I definitely did not think I would say after watching RNG's best of 5 play-in performance.
I think what's interesting about playing is that almost all playing teams always look like shit. But there's like a pretty established history at this point of playing teams doing well in main stage, group stage. So I think it does like having that time does help a lot with just stage nerves, with adapting, understanding what actually works from scrims and what doesn't work from scrims on stage, because
Hmm.
it's a very different scenario and changing like your mentality going into practice. So I'm used to playing teams looking like shit and then doing well in at least week one of group stage, right? So I expected DRX better than like a lot of the teams in their group. I expected RNG to do decently well. And I also think the and obviously like Fnatic has a very clear identity holdover from playing. So I think it's not too surprising that despite teams looking shaky, they look way better after a second week. And I expect to see more of that from like the main stage groups teams as well, like stronger. So I think Genji will be one of those teams with the stronger identity, but I just have so much trouble trusting Peanut. So he's
Yeah,
burnt
I've
he's
seen,
burned
I
me too
love,
many
first of
times.
all, people who don't know me should already know, like, or if you do know me, rather, you should already know that I effing love Peanut. And I've already seen the Peanut at Worlds memes coming out, which makes me sad. I will say this: I don't think I've seen a team in this group with better understanding of like side lane pressure than RNG, which has been a staple of theirs for years, I think, but it's really apparent in this group specifically, um, which is also very interesting to me. Sorry.
Yeah.
The more I talk, the more I cough. It's very unlucky.
So that's a fun transition for Reflect asked. It feels like every team has been blaming draft for losses. What would you say is the losing draft that won a game in group this week? RNG versus 100, which I already said was one of my favorite games of the tournament so far. Not because I think it was like a super close or super exciting game from that perspective, but because I feel like RNG had like terrible like shit tools in their draft and still managed to play like their style in terms of controlling sideways and controlling push and sideways in particular. And they did that with Graves. So they basically managed to control the jungle so that Wei didn't fall behind in farm, while also having him stall out like side pushes at tier twos on the opposite sides of the map. So I thought that the way that they played, like if you go back and watch that game and you watch them play, it's like, okay, this is how you play a game, identify the resources you have in your composition, and still manage to find a win despite having very difficult win cons within your draft itself. So if a team can do that, they can always just like pick for comfort and find a way for their team composition to work. Obviously, it was against 100, and I feel like 100 made a shit ton of mistakes as well. So that makes it
Mm-hmm.
a little bit less exciting, but I just really loved that they identified okay, we need Graves to clear waves here. And we need to get gold onto Gala and Xiaohu. Like, how do we accomplish that? And they set up the map, like, kind of with all of those ideas in mind and managed to come out with a victory. Especially since there's in a team comp that was like short range into Aatrox and Aphelios. So yeah, that was an exciting game for me. Yeah. Anything else about this group? Any surprises that you expect in group two, week two?
Um, I don't know about surprises. Like I said, I still think Gen G and RNG are going to be the teams that get out. I am curious. I think the thing I'm the most curious about is whether teams just start, like, even though obviously they're 1 and 2 in the group, whether teams just start taking away these picks from Mission, because I think that's the easiest way to like thoroughly dismantle CFO. Um, because he has a very specific small pool of mages that he's like phenomenal on. Um, and the way that they play is essentially like having uh Shun have a like pushing bot lane and slowly feeding mission until he just is like shitting damage in the mid to late game. Um, so I'm curious to see if teams identify that. I'm also curious to see if RNG stick with how they're playing around side lane pressure, because inevitably I have to mention the RNG curse where they decide to adjust and go back to 5v5 team fighting with a scaling hyper carry and like Ming plays Lulu or something. Um, it's happened before, and I hope it doesn't happen again.
This time,
So I want them to stick to what they've been doing because I think it's been really smart.
I have to tell you though, Emily, this time they have a mid laner, so that's important. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Just throwing that
sure.
out there. Poor Cryan. I feel bad for him.
I was gonna say, come on. He brought out Annie on the world stage. How can you hate
but yeah, I think like for me, I've basically feel like I've been screaming into the void since 2017 about how RNG are the best like side laning team in the world, and yeah, it's 2018 they decided to ruin their royal road by just like going all in on let's blind pick Poppy Galio and put UZI on a goddamn hyper carry that scales. But I think this year though we're seeing like way more of a Xiaohu centric team identity,
Mhm.
which is focused on that. I will say I think this is like our 100's draft was not just good because of the fact that they had a winning draft, but their bans, their 1, 2, 3 bans were good. They banned Lissandra Galio. I feel like
Yep.
of all of the RNG members, Xiaohu's pool is probably the easiest to pinch
Mhm.
because he is way more effective on champs that can roam to side lanes. And I think that if they play this kind of like a collie draft against a better team, so against like Genji, they probably lose the game, right? So I think that was like a good identification from 100 Thieves if we want to say like one good thing about anyone's drafts in these games. Yay! Um, in terms of players to watch, who do you got?
Hmm. I mean, I'm gonna go with this is gonna be a weird one. I'm not sure how many people realize how much I like this player, but I have known about Lehens since he was terrorizing Korean solo queue by having like a essentially like a singed only account and a support Elise only account and just he was someone who, at least in the West, there were a lot of incorrect assumptions as to why he wasn't getting picked up by a team. Um, and I just think it's cool to see him on a team where you do have enough stability from Chovy and Ruler that Lehens can just go ham with some of these very odd counter picks. And obviously, um, it doesn't always work out as we've seen. But I love that Genji has this like added spice from Lehens and these kind of slightly oddball picks that he has been a fan of for years. Like the Singed is not new.
Yeah.
Uh, Ever since I knew of him on solo queue and was like, oh, he's always high solo queue. Why isn't he getting picked up? Oh, he only plays weird shit. Um, I want to see Lehen succeed because I've actually been watching him for a really long time, and I think he's a good fit on this team. Like I said, because of the stability that players like Chovy and Ruler can bring to it. Um, the a kind of like wacky oddball player can kind of fit in when there's stability on the map elsewhere, especially in the mid lane. So it's a really cool team for him to be on, and I just want to see him succeed and force other teams to respond to these weird picks, right? And thus far, that hasn't happened because obviously, like I said, the Singe draft didn't really work out. But I would love to see it come out again as something maybe a little bit more cohesive and kind of force other teams to adapt. There's a meme in Korea where it's basically like Lahenge Singe is like, oh, you're thinking of counter picks for Singed, LMAO. Oh, you're practicing Singed? Like, that's
Yeah.
cursed. Like he basically like forces you. I'm paraphrasing the meme completely wrong, so someone should correct me on that. But like he basically forces other teams to respond to it, right? And he
Yep.
has a lot of weird counter picks for some standard supports. And I really want to see that come out from Gen G because it's a very fun, cool thing that he can do for this team.
Yeah, I think I gotta shout out Ming, like the opposite side of the pond every time, just because of the fact that he is the first Young Miracles player to make it onto an LPL team. I just remember like 2017 spring, I was like really really high on Hopium, and I was like, yeah, RNG is gonna be the top because this is when LPL still had the group stage format. It's like RNG is gonna be the best team in their group, because they had like the two conferences at the time. It's like RNG is going to be at the top of their group, and all the journalists were like, Kelsey, please stop hyping them. Like, they have no money. They put this roster together because they have no money. It's going to be bad. And then they went like 0-4 in the first 2 weeks before the like Chinese New Year break. And then they came back and they just shit on everyone, like playing 1-3-1. And UZI did all these interviews about how, yeah, like Ming is actually like taking a lot of the shot calling, a lot of the agency in the game. And then of course like Ming and Xiaohu's dynamic of being like the cheerleader and the harsh, cruel dad. Like Ming is just so great because it's like it's so rare to find a rookie player who one knows enough about the game to debut as a support, and two like a support who's also mechanically good. Like that is so strange. And like if you go throughout league history, like try to find a player who debuted like after 2014, because obviously no one knew anything about the game in the early years anyway, so it was a lot easier to debut as a rookie and know things. Um, and then who basically debuted like after 2014 and is able to do that. They basically don't exist. It's too insane like for to have like a player like Mako or Mig. So anyway, there you go. Let's do Group A, since that's the group tomorrow, and get it out of the way, and we'll talk about NA, and we'll call it a wonderful, wonderful day.
Oof.
Anything interesting in this group other than the fact that these teams are all like legacy orgs who have played each other multiple times?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of stories about these teams having been in groups with each other before. In particular, EDG and T1 just have this very interesting international, I wouldn't call it rivalry because it's very T1 sided. But I do think it's interesting that they kind of kept running into each other so much over the course of their org's history. Um, I think the big story to me for this group, in my opinion, is that I have no idea who's getting out. Like I am on broadcast tomorrow and I have to make some sort of prediction and I still have no idea who I'm gonna choose. Like
Spoil your prediction. Woo!
I'm probably gonna redo VOD reviews tonight. I'm obviously not gonna spoil my prediction. Maybe I'll flip
Rude.
a coin on broadcast. I'll do like a ton of VOD reviewing, and then I'll just be like, coin time. But I think that is the most interesting thing to me, right? Like kind of like how they held up the white the three whiteboards with the, circle of suck or circle of awesomeness, depending on how you want to see it. Because I do think each one of these teams has shown some really good things, and each one of these teams has shown some opportunity areas, let's just say. And so, with the three teams that are looking like they're vying to get out of this group, I think there's a really interesting dynamic there, not just because they're all legacy orgs with narratives between each other, that have come from being in groups together before or meeting each other in quarterfinals before, but also the fact that it really does seem like any of them can beat the other draft and like play in the immediate depending, um which is it's a very interesting group dynamic to have, whereas I think you look at other groups and there's a little bit more of a clear top two, or like this is the top team in the group in the case of Rogue. So that's what makes this group's storyline super interesting to me, is that like I honestly probably even after doing more VOD review tonight, we'll have no idea who is going to make it out because it's going to be that volatile in the moment.
I think the top story for me is just like Fnatic get exactly what they want like every game as well. For like they get uh Ornn top, which is probably Wonder's best tank champ. They get Azir. They get an aggressive bot lane, so it's like you should attempt to at least destabilize one of these things, right? Against Fnatic. I think things that are not real bans against Fnatic are like Sejuani bans. I would not ban Caitlyn against them. I think banning Caitlyn against comp is good, but not necessarily versus upset. Um, and I think like Caitlyn is probably one of the most falsely banned champs in the tournament. It's just not necessary to ban Caitlyn as much because not all the AD carries and supports can execute a lane like that.
Yeah.
Like
Yep.
Upset Hillsong are not gonna play like Caitlyn Lux and run over the game, guys. Like they're just not going to do it. Um, so I think it's interesting that those are the band diagnoses the teams are doing, and it's either they're just really traumatized. Like there are some situations where you play against a good Caitlyn and scrims, and then your players are just
Mm-hmm.
like, no, we can't win against this, and then they just like have a mental block, and you don't have another scrim day to prep against the Caitlyn or whatever, so you just have to ban it on stage because you know that as soon as like your players see it, it will demoralize them. So it's like, let's say they scrimmed all day against like Deft or Comp or something, and they're just like, "Holy shit, it's Caitlyn, we're gonna lose." The day before, then you ban Caitlyn. Obviously, like I can't presume to know exactly what the dynamics are, but it's so weird to me that Fnatic basically get everything they want every single game. Um, yeah. So good times on that one. I think that Humanoid's best champion by far is Azir. One thing that people
Mm-hmm.
do not seem to know is that he first got to Challenger by spamming like only Azir. He was a Z1 trick before that, but he didn't hit Challenger until he started perma spamming Azir. And then, so I think that it's crazy to me that in Azir meta, he's gotten Azir 3 times.
Yeah,
And
it's kind of, I feel very similarly about the way
mm-hmm,
that humanoid has not been targeted as I said about mission, right? Where I'm like, maybe you don't have to ban some like quote unquote OP champs. I
mm-hmm,
mean, I would consider Azir kind of a necessary ban against a lot of teams, to be
yeah.
quite honest. But in particular, I think it's a very worthwhile ban against humanoid, who admittedly, yes, he's been able to get his champions, but is having a phenomenal tournament individually.
Yeah, and I think it's like it also is very good for how Fnatic played jungle because Humanoid is often sacrificing lane states to force and sacrificing his HP and having to take earlier backs. Like if you go back and watch his domestic games on like every single champion he plays to get pryos so that Razor can control jungle, and this is like kind of what they figured out how to play in playoffs that allowed them to go on that run. Um, so the fact that they are able to give you a champion that basically his entire job is to lose all your HP so that you get prio in lane, and so the enemy mid laner is as useless as you are in early skirmishes, is and then have like Razork do his thing. Also, is just like very fundamental to how Fnatic wants to play. So it isn't just that Humanoid is good at Azir; it is that Azir in particular and the Azir playstyle is extremely good for all of Fnatic. So that would be like a champion that I would ban before, um, like maybe even a Graves or a like definitely before a Graves, but like the only champion that I would consider like definitely banning before Azir would be like a Maokai. Like I would even open Yumi
Mm.
against them to ban the Azir because I think they don't want to play like a Yumi style anyway. So yeah, it's interesting for sure. We'll see. We'll see how teams adapt if they watch games and things like that. I think probably like EDG. I already talked about Mako, etc. EDG is exciting because I still actually kind of feel like it's gonna be like T1 Fnatic coming out of this group, but I guess I just like don't trust LPL teams. Like if you watch, you can tell how much LPL someone watches by how much they trust them. You know.
The
Like,
less I will say this, the less they trust them, the more LPL they watch for sure.
yes.
I've had like a very lengthy conversation with Jordan,
Mm-hmm.
Lyric, about this, where he was basically like, why do you always underestimate LPL teams at tournaments, right? And I've said
Mm-hmm.
this on making the rounds before and stuff, but just to reiterate, I think it's because the LPL season is so long and there are so many teams that play very differently from each other, which means that naturally you're going to go up against teams that play a play style that's very good into your play style, right? And it means that any team that comes out of the LPL, you will see a lot more of their shakiness. You'll see a lot more of their opportunity areas by virtue of the fact that you've watched them play through the LPL, because that's the nature of the league and has been for quite some time now, actually,
Mm-hmm.
which makes it really interesting, but also means that, like, you will see a so-called top team lose to like a 12th place team or 13th place team because of a playstyle matchup or because they just completely biffed draft or something like that, right? And that'll happen with a best of 3 series. So every LPL team I feel that comes to Worlds, you owe, or at least for me, I always see so many more of their flaws than I've seen present from other teams. At least it feels that way.
Yeah. I, in fairness though, like I do see more weaknesses in like how Fnatic can be destabilized, but there's a lot of weaknesses in how Scout can be destabilized.
Yep.
Destabilized, for example, like I think Scout's patience on control mages is really bad. So if he'll play like an Azir, he'll try to fight at level 3 and lose because Azir's like early skirmishes are dog shit. So and EDG just in general, like always try to hand check. I'm like my favorite story about EDG is from like 20, it was 20, I want to say it was 2016 because it was that MSI that I heard it,
Mm.
where teams were picking Twitch and Delusion. LPL teams were picking Twitch and Delusion. I was like, why the fuck are you picking Twitch and Delusion? This makes no sense. If you think about the matchup for 5 seconds, it makes zero sense.
Yeah, that's
And
awful.
they were like, oh, it's a counter pick. And I was like, why is it a counter pick? And then I ended up talking to like some EDG guys, and they're like, oh, we started picking Twitch and Delusion to bait the enemy jungle to go bot. So then we would just like 3v3 them bot, and we'd always win because Clearlove is better than their jungler. I was that was
Oh
legit
my god.
EDG's mentality. They baited like the entire LPL region into picking Twitch and Delusion because in scrims, when they would pick Twitch and Delusion, they would win the 3v3 bot side. And so a lot of teams started to think Twitch was good in Delusion. I was like, this is actually not a real story. I refuse to believe that this actually happened. But that was
That is incredibly cursed.
that is it is so cursed. But that is to me like the definition of how EDG think about the game is like our players are better, so we'll just win the fight, and it's good if we bait them into fighting us when we by having like a shit item power spike or something, because we'll still win. And that's like if you watch them play, that's how they fucking play.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an interesting one. Yeah, EDG players to watch.
I'm gonna cheat and go with two. One of them I'm gonna talk a little bit about broadcast tomorrow, so I won't go super into them, but I want to talk about them for the same reasons. So I'm gonna kind of couple them together. And it's gonna be Mako and Carrier. And the reason for that is because Mako, we've talked a lot about EVG and some of their glaring weaknesses. And I think a lot of those weaknesses can be shored up simply by Mako being on an engaged support. Now that engaged supports are back in the meta, despite the fact that obviously he had a strong Yumi performance in their last game, because Yumi is still around. Love that for all of us. I think Mako is someone who has just an incredible initiation sense, very visibly the best on this team. And I think it, if you don't have to rely on Gia to be making those engages and having Mako make them instead, the team looks exponentially better because his decision making is a lot better. similarly. I think T1 are a team that, um, outside of the Caitlin Lux, which they obviously can crush with it and play around it really well. I think Carria is also someone who I personally love to see on engaged supports for the same reason. He has such incredible mechanical prowess. He can control entire team fights with a strong initiator, very similar to what I just said about Mako. And so both of these supports, again, we've seen them play Yumi in this group. But I also think that since the avenue for engaged supports is open, and provided that people maybe keep Yumi permabanned, we will see both of these teams be able to, or both of these supports rather, be able to showcase just how good they are at choosing some of these team fights. So it's cheating, but I picked 2 players.
Nice. I'm gonna actually shout out Zeus. We haven't really talked about T1 that much. T1 are so weird because they're like the ego team of the tournament. And it's
Yep.
funny to say they're the ego team in the tournament after I just described like the most ego thing possible with Edward Gaming, but I would still say like T1 are more ego. But only Zeus is actually able to consistently back it up because Zeus is actually good. I'm kidding. T1 has a lot of good players on it. They've just not had the greatest year, and I think that's where a lot of criticisms come from. Is just like when you're an LCK fan watching LCK, you're not used to watching LCK players like flip every fight. So a lot of
Mhm.
times they look like shit, but they are still good players. But I think Zeus is consistently able to back it up. I think Zeus, obviously, everyone has heard the story of scouted on Diamond 2 and learned to play the game
Mhm.
correctly. But he's actually playing extremely well, and always really fun to watch. Like if you want to watch a good carry top lane performance, like T1 is probably your best bet. So yeah, woo. Anyway, let's go on to. We have to talk about NA before we break.
The topic near and dear to our hearts. Unironically, actually. I'm not memeing in that.
Um, yeah, for me, it's like I feel like you could go back to any one of our making the rounds VODs, and I don't really have a whole lot new to say. Um, but I guess for me, I I've I'm fine with it. I don't know what else to say. Go ahead,
Oh my
Emily. Do
god.
you have thoughts?
Alright. I have a lot to say. Hopefully they'll come out as nuanced as I want them to, because I feel
Mhm.
like there are a lot of facets to this. The first thing I want to say is that I don't think that their current winless, any team's current winless performances is reflective of some actual really good changes that we've seen in both
True.
amateur and academy over the past 2 years. And obviously, that is still going to take time as players hopefully matriculate up the system and younger players are actually getting the chance to start on LCS teams. However, I will always be a firm believer that despite the fact that obviously North America has a comparatively small competitive solo queue and some obvious solo queue issues, some of which were shored up by Champions Queue, and that's a whole other story. As to like who's playing it, who's not playing it, I've already seen that going on. But I think this is not necessarily indicative of some actually really good quality of life changes that were made to the NA ecosystem. And I will always believe that even if we do need to import players due to the fact that our solo queue is so small, so comparatively the top percentage, if it's the same, basically, if it's the same percentage of players as another major region, you are still going to get fewer players based on numbers. I think that you still do need to pay attention to your own players that are coming up from the NA ladder. And I think there have been a lot of quality of life changes in amateur, in academy, both on a structural level with the broadcast itself, all this other stuff that maybe you're not seeing the results now, but I would be really sad to see some of those be immediately reacted to in a very like cutting way. Because I do think there are some good things that have been in the pipeline over the past years. And then I'm trying to think of what the other thing I was going to say was. Oh my god, I lost my train of thought because there are so many things that I wanted to say about this. Um, oh, the other thing I wanted to talk about, which is really interesting to me and kind of like hurts my heart to say, because in season, one thing that I on broadcast have talked about a lot is how much I really love when I specifically said it in regards to top laners because I think it happens a lot with top lane. There's so much focus on the 1v1, there's so much focus on your actual laning skill because sometimes you don't get a lot of help. And, you know, we've typically seen a lot of players not necessarily be willing to slam like hard counter picks, right? Um, and then now coming to international and seeing, for example, drafts like C9's first draft, which is obviously a very like we believe in our hands draft. Um, to bring that out and lose with it is it hurts me because I think I agree with like both sides of it. I think in drafting for international competition, North American teams should have some default scaling options, some default things that make a team composition easier to execute because they are going up against stiffer competition. However, I also don't want to denigrate some of the changes I have seen over the past year with players be a lot more willing to lock in counter picks in LCS. That's something I really liked talking about on broadcast and something I've respected players a lot for. Um, because I think a lot of times in the past we've seen players coming up from academy and amateur and saying that they believe in their hands, but then it not coming to fruition, right? They play a lot more hesitantly on the LCS stage. And I feel like with players that we've seen this year, we've seen some of that hesitancy fade a little bit with certain players in LCS this year. And I want to continue seeing that going. Like I want to continue to see that from LCS, right? But I also do think that you need to change a little bit. Sorry. Um, for international. So I'm really stuck on how to talk about this, right? Because I feel like I've done such a terrible job of presenting this argument, and it's not even an argument, it's just a conflict within myself that I don't really know how to comment on, if that makes sense. Hopefully people understand what I just said because it
Yeah.
makes sense in my head, but it sounds very long and rambly.
So
I'm sorry.
there are a couple of things that I think haven't been brought up that are obvious. One is that the lack of ProView, I think, has ProView was doing a really good job of giving tools to LCS players to visualize situations. And I think the biggest problem with our current system is that if you're playing the NA ladder, there will be less of if you're a type of player who learns from like constantly grinding and making mistakes and getting punished for them and making mistakes and getting punished from them, you probably won't improve that much in NA because the quality of games that you're experiencing do not punish you for mistakes. So this idea that you have to like just constantly grind more games to get better in NA is just like not applicable because in some ways if all you're doing is playing the games and you're not reviewing them or you're not looking at VODs or you're not looking at other resources that will help you look at the game differently, you're probably getting negative feedback on how certain matchups or certain situations actually play out. Like there will be this conception that a matchup is playable or that is just not playable based on like what happens. Like for example, I would say that the Aatrox Fiora one is one of the biggest ones, and like a lot of Akali matchups are very ping dependent and things like that. So if you're playing matchups on high ping, you'll have a different feedback in terms of like your practice in terms of what is actually happening on certain pings. Um, I think like Gwen, like a lot of these skill matchups that are very dependent on like getting auto attacks off, stuff like that, are hurt because you cannot practice them that well in like a solo queue environment. And then now what has happened is that CQ exists or Champions Queue exists, and there is no direct pathway from NA solo queue and doing well in NA solo queue to get to Champions Queue. So the like fantasy fulfillment of going from I did really well in solo queue, now I can play with the pros doesn't exist, especially for players who do not check Twitter, don't have Twitter. So if you're like a 15-year-old who's like cracked at the game, you don't know that the amateur ecosystem exists. You don't know how to play against pros. You don't even know about that kind of thing because you're not there isn't a direct pathway through the client to get to play against pros. And also like there's a much higher and much more dense population on the East Coast, and we just put the highest quality of gameplay available strictly on the West Coast during regular season. So that sucks too. So there's a lot of stuff that feels like our talent pool is going to get minimized, and also because Champions Queue exists, I think a lot of teams are scouting solo queue less and just focusing on Champions Queue, which also limits the perspectives that you have. So that's where, like, if I had a go forward plan, it is definitely still like focusing on high schools to expand the like engagement of the game and expand the NA player base, and focusing on because there's a lot of infrastructural issues that need to be tackled to even get kids to play. A lot of mismanagement of clubs, a lot of things like that that have happened that basically has been ignored for years and years and years and years. And then Champions Queue itself is like there has to be a fix for that, or we're basically going to lose a potential generation of like players. So those would be my go forward recommendations in terms of like if you actually want to expand the NA talent pool and engagement with the game. Yeah, so there you go. That's what I have to say. You run into collegiate and players. I don't think that's feasibly impossible. Like if you're a 15-year-old kid and you don't have Twitter, etc., and you run into these players, like it's very possible to either not DM them or you run into them and you don't exactly know what's going on and you don't know how to get into to apply for a champs queue. Like I've actually met kids who just like play the game in high school and they just don't know what the fuck is going on, you know? Um, so I think that that's like, and they play the game after school, so they're not even in clubs, they're not even anything. So I think that it's not completely unfeasible. It does have to do with the weak social aspect of the game of LoL, and that's what I think needs to be improved to improve the pathways. Like people actually have to work on the social aspect of the game. Um, in terms of like creating a pathway that's very clear in client for CQ and also improving like club engagement from Riot and teams. Like if you are improving your club engagement, even like locally, that's better than nothing, right? So that's my thought. Yeah. Hello. That's what I have to say about NA. Anything else, Emily? Emily died. She's gone. I think you're muted. Cannot hear you.
I am. I muted myself because I was
Nice.
coughing. Wow, I'm an idiot.
North America.
Good to know.
Woo!
I just figured it was hotel internet because also that.
Anyway, that was my rant. I think the other thing is that we're seeing NA teams suck more in team fights. So from that perspective, I can see the idea that they're going for these like super snowbally comps or these comps that don't go into team fights, right? That don't rely on team fights to win. But yeah, I mean, and then of course, like the quote from Sven of basically if you're first seed or if you're a high seed, you end up playing against a lot of other high seeds, and then no matter what strategy you try to take works. So you just end up losing, and then you lose confidence in what you're good at, right? Like that's also a thing that comes out, and that's why NA teams often look lost, is because they suddenly get exposed to like the global scrim meta of the top teams, and they're like, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing anymore. So that's another thing.
Fun shit.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Losing
Woo!
doesn't equate to learning nothing. But let's put it this way, like let's say you draft like a certain comp, right? And you are going into a game and you're losing like a skirmish at level 3. So you aren't being able to practice like and then the game just feels like completely crushing and lost from that point. So basically the information that you're gaining is like feedback on level ones, you're gaining feedback on like how you're playing skirmishes in certain situations or like how you're setting up for like those parts of the game. And then that's like the kind of feedback you're getting, but you're not getting the ability to practice like playing out the rest of the game from a point of a lead if those skirmishes go well, or you're not getting feedback on how to play out like team fights at a more even state. Like you're basically getting feedback on how to play out situations in a very specific situation where you're just getting fucking crushed within the first 3 minutes of the game, right? So I definitely agree. Losing doesn't equate not getting information and not getting feedback, but it also limits like if you're getting just blown out every game, it limits the amount of feedback that you do get from the scrim itself. So yeah, I think that that's definitely, and like obviously draft is not the only thing you can adapt to and change, right? But
Mhm.
yeah, but that's the thing. Like you have to be able to learn from abstract ideas to improve in North America. And it is so hard to consistently like brain abuse yourself because so many people like learn by doing or learn kinesthetically. So if you spend your entire time like you climbed a challenger, just like constantly grinding games, right? And then you get to a point where you've won a lot and you then are told that there is the way that you've always played a matchup is actually wrong because the people that you're practicing the matchup against is fucking wrong. So you have to look up the odds of people playing the matchup in another country. Um, and then of course like the availability of that is limited even more from ProView to have access to new ideas on how to play the matchup. So you're basically forced to constantly ask yourself like, but what if I'm getting the wrong feedback from experiential learning? What if they're doing it wrong? What if they're doing it wrong? What if they're doing it wrong? Which you can do, and I fully believe you can do that, but it is so hard to constantly abuse your brain doing that. Like you have to be on all the time, and the decisions you make and the critical thinking that you get like throughout the day is going to get worse throughout the day. So just like when people say constantly spam games, it is so bad. Like that's what I said at the start. Is like the constant feedback that people in NA get is like spam more games, play more. Like NA players are lazy, but that doesn't actually fucking help because the people you're playing is also suck. So you have to find other ways to practice and other ways to get better. And so like I fully agree with you. Like it has to be more like visualization based in terms of how we're learning. But that's not the feedback that people get when they go on international stage. That's not what fans like DM them, right? So yeah. Because fans like hear, oh, Asian teams are so good because they play like three scrim blocks a day and they're just constantly like learning that way. And it's like, well, that doesn't work. Like if you use a butter knife to hack at an object, it's not going to be as effective as using a $100 kitchen knife. You know, it just doesn't work. Yes, that is what I'm saying about bad mechanics. Yeah, it's a
For what
good
it's worth, I
time.
can't see chat because I don't trust my internet to have Twitch chat on at the same time as I have video and Discord up.
Yeah. But anyway, this is a very long, nuanced topic, and the more I rant about it, the more frustrated I get. So, uh, good times.
I'm just
Um,
sad.
I I'm not sad, but I can't explain why I'm not sad. So that's all I'll say.
Oh my god.
um, either way, I'm gonna support and cheer for NA teams in week 2. Let's get it, guys. Woo!